Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia. It's the start of June. I've just come out of hibernation and we all know what that means. It's the announcement for this year's Jane Austen July. If you've been around for a while, you will be well familiar with Jane Austen July. It's now running for the 7th year, which seems weird. If Jane Austen July was a child, then it would now be able to read Jane Austen for itself. Though if Jane Austen July was a child, I would definitely be the neglectful step-aunt rather than the doting parent. Jane Austen July was brought to life and is being brought to life again by my wonderful co-hosts Marissa from Blatantly Bookish and Katie from Books and Things, both of whom have also done their own announcement videos, which I'll link down below. Do check them out because the announcement videos are all slightly different because we all recommend different books, different films for the challenges that we have set. What is Jane Austen July? It's kind of self-explanatory. It's a month in which we celebrate Jane Austen, her writing, her life, her time period, and we consume media by her and connected to her writing. Let's get right into the challenges for Jane Austen July, which have remained the same, more or less. We did a little tweak a few years ago, which we've kept. So if you're familiar with them, then, well, you can probably recite them along with me. The first challenge is and has always been to read one of Jane Austen's 6 main novels. This is also the only challenge you kind of should be doing if you want to participate in Jane Austen July. All the others are optional add-ons. I don't think I've ever gone through a Jane Austen July where I've actually managed to check every single one off the list. So don't stress about the challenges, just enjoy Jane Austen and her writing. And the main way to do that is, of course, to read her work. So challenge number 1, read one of Jane Austen's main 6 novels. They are, of course, in roughly chronological order of writing. Northanger Abbey, in which a teenager goes adventuring in Bath, gets overexcited over an old manor house, and meets a hot priest. Sense and Sensibility, in which 2 sisters move to the countryside and mostly fail at relationships. Pride and Prejudice, in which a young woman has to keep her chaotic family from ruining a potential thing she's got going with a conveniently handsome rich man. Mansfield Park, in which a shy teenager who gets trampled over by her adopted family finally learns to stand up for herself. That is a very generous summary of Mansfield Park. Emma, in which a rich, spoiled woman who likes to play matchmaker gets a first taste of the consequences of her actions. And of course, Persuasion, in which jaded, middle-aged, well past her prime, what do you mean she's only 27? She gets a second chance at love. If you're still confused, which I don't know why you would be after these excellent summaries of the books, I recommend you check out my video Where to Start with Jane Austen. If you're completely unfamiliar with her writing, but you want to give her a go, have a look at that video. It's a few years old, but I think it's still accurate to my opinion. As always, for this first challenge, there is a group read. This year we are reading Sense and Sensibility, starting on the 1st of July and finishing on the 16th. I will also put the group read schedule in the description box, as well as any other links, information about the books I'm talking about. You know the deal. If you need any information relating to this video, have a look in the description box. But now let's move on to the second challenge, which is to read a Jane Austen work that's not one of these main 6 novels. That's not one of her main canon of books. So that includes unfinished works, works that were published long after her death, juvenilia, unpublished works, all of that kind of stuff. Here is some of what you can read. There are collections of her juvenilia. This is books that Jane Austen wrote as a child, as a teenager. Entertaining, you can already see her talent emerging, and incredibly sharp as well, definitely. Very funny reading. You can also read her epistolary novella, Lady Susan, which was written during her lifetime but published a few decades after. This is, again, a very sharp, very funny story of probably the most unlikable Jane Austen heroine, as in the most amoral one. She's a widow and she's on the hunt for a new man with complete disregard for the people around her, including her own daughter. So it's kind of a Jane Austen writes a villain kind of a story, which I enjoyed reading. I believe I did a review video of that. You know where to find that. You could read Jane Austen's letters. I definitely should have prepared for this, shouldn't I, and actually brought a pile of books to show you. There's collections of her letters that are annotated and edited in a way that explains context. So, you know, when she talks about a Mr. So-and-so, then you know who she actually means. I found the letters fascinating reading from a historian's point of view, just to see what Jane Austen talked about in those letters. Or you could join us for the group reads that we are scheduling for the second half of July. And those group reads are, first, we're reading Sanditon. This is an unfinished novel. I think in my edition, it's about 60 pages long, so there really isn't much of it. It's the beginning of a romance set in a seaside town. This has received a bit of attention in recent years because I believe ITV made a miniseries adaptation of it. I think there's 2 or 3 seasons out. I haven't watched it, but I'm going to join the group read for this one and then hopefully also watch the adaptation if it's still available online. Anyway, we're reading this from the 17th to the 22nd of July. These group reads, by the way, there's discussion groups on Goodreads which you can join and chat about the books as we all read them together. The second group read is another unfinished novel called The Watsons. There's even less of this one. This one's only about 50 pages in my edition. And this follows a clergyman's family called The Watsons. I don't know any more about this. I'm a little bit too afraid to look up summaries because both Sanditon and The Watsons I have not yet read. And I kind of want to go into them spoiler-free, even though I fully expect both books to kind of stop after the exposition. The Watsons we're reading from the 23rd to the 31st of July. Now we're already on to challenge number 3, which is to read a non-fiction work about Jane Austen or about her time. Her lifetime, being the late Georgian period. She lived from 1775 to 1817. But when we talk about Jane Austen's time, we don't take it quite that strictly. So the time period kind of includes, let's say, a decade before and a decade after, roughly. So don't be too strict about this. Now, there's obviously loads and loads of biographies of Jane Austen, books about her specifically. I have to say, I'm not a fan of biographies. I just don't find them that entertaining. To me, they kind of feel a bit like work, like research, like learning. For recommendations for biographies, I suggest you look at Marissa's and Katie's announcement videos because I am certain they'll have some recommendations for those. There's 2 books that I like to recommend for this. The first one is The Time Traveller's Guide to Regency Britain by Ian Mortimer. This is part of his series of books called The Time Traveller's Guide to, so I think he did one called The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England and so on. The Regency Britain one came out a few years ago. I read it as it came out and I made a review of it. So this is a recommendation with a caveat because I did have quite a few criticisms, quite a few things I didn't like about this book, but overall it is still an interesting read, a fascinating resource, and one that I think many people would enjoy. But do have a look at my review video before you make the decision to buy that book. I'll link it down below. If you're up for a bit more of an academic read, I also really enjoyed Amanda Vickery's book, Behind Closed Doors, At Home in Georgian England. This is an exploration of the home. Now, I find that very interesting because most of Jane Austen's stories are set within the home. They're set in private spaces, but those private spaces used as a social space because very rarely do the characters sit at home by themselves. There's always visitors, they're always going to other people's homes, they're always traveling to visit people for longer periods of time. But the home is a really important space in the time period, and I really like how that is explored within the socioeconomic setting of the Georgian period. The next challenge, challenge number 4, is my favorite of the challenges, and that is to read a retelling of a Jane Austen book or a historical fiction set in the time of Jane Austen. And again, we're taking the time of Jane Austen to be a not very precise time period. So use your own discretion. This challenge, I hope, appeals to a wide variety of readers. So let me break down the types of books you can pick for this challenge. The first one is straight up modern retellings. So this is authors that take the basic plot of a Jane Austen novel and transplant it into a different time period, most commonly the modern era. Though I'm not gonna lie, I would love something like a retelling of Sense and Sensibility set in the 1920s or something like that. But no, these are usually set in the modern era. One of the most popular ones is probably Bridget Jones's Diary, which I honestly cannot recommend. It's so outdated and not in a fun way, not in a quirky look at what the 90s were like way, but lots of people enjoy it, so gotta mention that. I feel like it was certainly a first in the genre, maybe not the absolute first, but it was a defining novel for the Jane Austen retelling section of the bookshop. Here are some newer ones that I quite enjoyed. A few years ago I read Where the Rhythm Takes You by Sarah Das, which is a YA retelling of Persuasion. Already intriguing, right? Set on Tobago. It's a fun, as you can tell by the title, it's music inspired. The Frederick Wentworth character is a musician in this. It's a perfect read for the summer, especially if you're into YA. Ayesha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin is a Canadian retelling of Pride and Prejudice. It hits all the same notes, it's funny, it's romantic, it takes into consideration, and this is something I really like about that one, societal aspect of Pride and Prejudice, because Pride and Prejudice is not just a love story, it's also a story about class and about wealth. Ayesha at Last takes those elements and sticks them in modern day Canada in a way that I really enjoyed. This one is not YA, so this one's an adult novel. That sounds filthy. Another way you can fulfill challenge number 4 is by reading a story that is set within the world of Jane Austen's novels. Prequels, sequels, stories that take place alongside the events of the books. Basically, this is fan fiction. A really popular one is Longbourn by Jo Baker, which is set during and after the events of Pride and Prejudice from the perspective of a maid in the Longbourn household. And this is a character, I think her name might be Hannah, whose name is mentioned exactly once in the novel Pride and Prejudice, and the author, Jo Baker, she took that character and spun her story. I found it interesting enough, but it didn't grip me like it did many other readers. I'm adding it into these recommendations because I know lots of people really love Jo Baker's Longbourn, and it is, I think, one of the better examples of that particular style of retelling. I'm generally not a huge fan of that particular style of retelling, and I'll tell you why. Because I think anytime an author approaches Jane Austen stories and her characters, it's really hard to do them justice. It's really hard to read a character like Elizabeth Bennet written by someone other than Jane Austen, because if you're familiar with the books, then you're so aware of the differences. So that's what I find a bit tricky about these. However, if you are curious about that style, then Longbourn is a really good one to pick up, as is my next recommendation, Charlotte by Helen Moffat, which is also set in the world of Pride and Prejudice. And as you can tell by the title, this is the story of Charlotte Lucas, who is Elizabeth Bennet's friend in the novel Pride and Prejudice, and gets her own story in this one. Just like with Longbourn, I found it an interesting read, but for me it works best if I sort of try and divorce the Charlotte Lucas from Charlotte, from Pride and Prejudice, because they don't feel like quite the same character to me. There's a third way in which you can fulfill this challenge, and that is to read a piece of historical fiction set in Jane Austen's time. We've already talked about the definition of Jane Austen's time, so I'm not going to repeat that here. There is, of course, a lot of Regency romance. That's such a big subgenre of romance books and subgenre of historical fiction, and one I'm only just dipping my toes into. A couple of years ago, I read Georgette Heyer's book, The Unknown Ajax, which was my first Georgette Heyer, so far my only, but definitely not my last. She invented the Regency romance genre in the mid-20th century. I enjoyed The Unknown Ajax, did a review, you know where to find that, and what was that? Lost my train of thought. It is entertaining. I really enjoyed reading Georgette Heyer, and I'm probably going to pick one out for this year as well. But the Regency romance genre obviously continued on and is still so popular today. The new season of Bridgerton's currently on. Obviously that's based on books by, I want to say, Julia Quinn. I haven't read those, so this is not a recommendation, just a mention. But romance isn't the only genre of fiction set in the Regency period. A lot of Victorian fiction is set in the Regency period. A lot of books by Charles Dickens are set then, as is, for example, a lot of Bronte novels. Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights. These are all books you can read for Jane Austen July, which seems a bit weird, but they fit the brief. If you're into early 20th century literature, you could, for example, read Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. That's also set in the 1810s. And this is a creepy, romantic, Cornwall setting smuggler story. I really enjoyed it. Kindred by Octavia Butler, completely different type of story, which was published in, I want to say 1974, definitely in the 1970s. And this is a time travel narrative in which a young black woman in America suddenly finds herself in the middle of a plantation in 1813-ish. Definitely not the sort of book that you think of when you think Jane Austen July, but you can read it for this challenge. And if you haven't read it, I would absolutely recommend it. There's also lots of modern historical novels set in the period. One that I read quite a few years ago now was Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. This is set in Iceland and is based on the real historical figure of, cannot remember her name, who was the last person to be executed in Iceland for murder. So that's her story. As you can tell, not a very uplifting read, but a really, really good one, very atmospheric. We move on to the fifth challenge, which is to read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen. So this is someone who roughly lived, in her lifetime. This is the challenge that people find hardest because we love Jane Austen, we read something that was published around the same time and find that it's not as good. So again, you can think outside the box a little bit for this one. Novels that are often recommended for this, like Marriage by Susan Ferrier, Belinda by Maria Edgeworth. I enjoyed them for what they were, which is books that are not as good as Jane Austen. They are adjacent in that they're societal satires, there's romance and family drama, but they're not as tightly written as Jane Austen, they're not as well plotted. They don't feel as modern as Jane Austen does. But if you want to explore more of that vibe, then definitely have a look at those two examples in particular. You can also read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which I think is one of the best novels of its time and is definitely as good as Jane Austen. This was published in 1818. We all know the story of Frankenstein and his creature. Read the original story. It is excellent. It reads very modern. It's very introspective, but also obviously quite gory and violent and action-packed. I really think it's one of the best novels of the 19th century. If you haven't read it, this is the opportunity for you to do so. Thinking outside the box, there are novels that fit this brief. Let me rephrase that. There are books that fit this brief that aren't novels. The first one is one I haven't actually read, and that is Anne Lister's Diaries. She became more known in popular media thanks to the BBC adaptation Gentleman Jack. She's known as the first modern lesbian. I don't actually know who came up with that description, but you know, she deserves it. Her story was really brought to light by a researcher named Helena Whitbread, who decoded her diaries because they were, for obvious reasons, written in code. She edited them, she published them, she was beating the drum. She was really trying to get Anne Lister into the public consciousness as a historical figure who we should know about. You could read, for another non-fiction work, anything by any of the many philosophers of the time. For example, Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, whose manifesto with the title A Vindication of the Rights of Woman is one of the first sort of proto-feminist texts. Obviously, Mary Wollstonecraft's feminism is a far cry from what we consider the movement to be today, but it's a really fascinating work detailing some opinions that were probably quite scandalous at the time. It's not a fun read as such, it's quite dry in parts, it's very wordy, but it is interesting. You could also read something like the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, a lot of which were published in the early 19th century. These are stories that you already know. But have you ever read the original? You probably haven't unless you speak German, but even an English translation of those originals is worth reading because these stories, they are not like the Disney adaptations. You already know that. So if you're interested in those sorts of fairy tales, but actually reading the originals, you can do that and have it be a part of Jane Austen July. This was it for the reading challenges. We always have 2 watching challenges. And they are challenge number 6, to watch a direct screen adaptation of a Jane Austen novel. There is loads of them. I'm not going to list them all, so I'll just really quickly tell you my favorites. Pride and Prejudice 1995. You cannot beat this adaptation. Sorry, Keira Knightley. Emma 2009. This is the BBC miniseries, 4 episodes long, and in my opinion, a really beautiful adaptation, although I do also like Emma 2020. And finally, one that I only recently discovered, and that is Love and Friendship, which is an adaptation of Lady Susan. Don't know why they changed the title. And this is from, I think, 2016 with Kate Beckinsale. A bit more arty adaptation that I think really hits the tone of the book. And the final challenge, number 7, is to watch a modern screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book. So this is kind of like the equivalent of the reading challenges with the retellings, but in movie, TV, YouTube format. Here are some recommendations. The classics in that genre include obviously Bridget Jones's Diary, Clueless, which is a modern adaptation of Emma. But here are my personal recommendations. One that I watched 2 years ago for Jane Austen July, and also came out 2 years ago, Fire Island, which is a modern gay adaptation of Pride and Prejudice set on the New York resort of Fire Island. A really excellent film that matches the themes in the book and has some really imaginative ways of taking those themes and transplanting them into the modern day. Lost in Austen from 2008. This is a miniseries that is extremely silly. If you watch that, be aware of that, in which a Jane Austen fan gets sucked into the world of Pride and Prejudice and then sort of becomes the Elizabeth Bennet character. I don't want to call it trashy, but it is a bit trashy and just very entertaining. I love it. Pride and Prejudice from 2004. Actually, you know what? This is a classic. I really should have mentioned this up there with Clueless. This is set in modern day, well, 20 years ago, modern day India. It's a Bollywood-inspired adaptation. It's very fun, it's very funny, and it's got some really catchy songs. There's also loads of YouTube adaptations. Most of you will have seen or at least heard of the Lizzie Bennet Diaries by now. That already came out like 10 years ago. But one that I want to recommend that you might not have seen is Rational Creatures, which is a YouTube adaptation of Persuasion set in America. The whole playlist is about the same length as a movie, so you can queue up the playlist and watch the whole story. It's really well done. Again, some really imaginative ways that the themes in the story of Persuasion have been picked and transplanted into the modern era. Of course, you'll find the link to Rational Creatures in the description box. Right, that was it. As always, these announcement videos end up being much longer than I thought they were going to be. I hope I've talked about everything I need to talk about. As you've maybe noticed, I've not been very present on YouTube these days. Just life has taken over. But I have got a few things lined up for Jane Austen July. It's not going to be as busy as it's been in previous years on this channel, but I hope I can get at least 1 or 2 videos done. The next you'll hear from me is probably when I've decided on my TBR. My shortlist for this TBR is getting longer and longer, but I'm going to have to be ruthless and actually cut it down to a manageable amount of books that I can actually read in July. So you can think about your TBR as well and start planning your Jane Austen July. And I'll see you again at the end of the month. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.